Subjective versus objective or absolute truth. Justin, what is the difference between these philosophical schools of thoughts, and how has it really changed in recent times? What is subjective truth and what is absolute truth in terms of a philosophical framework? There's a few philosophers kind of line into two different camps. The philosophers who lean that there are objective truths in this on this planet. Some things, I mean, besides talking about math and science, I'm talking about through a mental framework that some things are
Morals,
true.
ethics.
Yeah, and they will
Yeah.
always be true. And the subjective truth would be that, okay, maybe this is true now, but it won't always be. So it is that there are no certainties, and there is only subjectivity for everything.
Ever since the late 60s, and we had the consciousness revolution, there has been a tremendous drive to unencumber the individual from any obligations that might be placed on the individual. This implies a very subjective, view of the world, because an objective truth would apply to everyone, no matter what, even if it meant limiting the rights or limiting, the potential freedom that an individual would have. I would argue, in the scheme of things, you sometimes have to limit freedom in order to actually grow it. My favorite go-to example is we all stop at red lights at 3 o'clock in the morning, even if the intersection is empty, because even though we're limiting our own personal freedom and liberty to get to home quicker or whatever, right? Having a working traffic system where everyone follows the same rules, even if we sometimes have to limit ourselves, curtail our freedom, we all get so much more in the end. In other words, it's very easy to see the meaning in all of this for the sacrifice that we put through. But anyways, the point is that objective truths would otherwise constrain the individual. The more subjective you make truths, the more subjective you make reality, the less encumbered the individual can become.
So, what is an example of current day, the subjective versus objective truth, kind of in everyday life?
Probably a subjective truth that masquerades as an objective truth, falsely so, would be like wokeism. So think like genders or whatever, right? The point is that you can make an argument that nature prescribes, for all intents and purposes, for 99 point whatever percent of the population, whatever, right? You're either male or you're female. This also means that if you have an XY chromosome set and you want to be a female, like, no, you can't do this. This is not an objective truth. Or likewise, if you have an XX chromosome set and you want to be treated as a male or whatever, right? Objectively, that's not true. Now, do whatever you want to do or whatever, right? If you're a dude and want to wear a dress, or you're a chick and you want to wear, guy clothes, go for it, whatever. I'm not trying to say you should or shouldn't do that. But that would be an example of the objective truth constraining the individual in the sense that...
Let's see if I get this right. The subjective would be women, people today saying, okay, men and women are equal, therefore they need to be equal in all aspects. So it is okay if a man and woman just completely switches gender because they're equal. So there's no difference, when objectively speaking, there are differences between men and women.
Yeah, the way I would say it is that, in the realm of man, or it's just like that, in the realm of humans, something that we create, we can create a sense of equality, even if it's not underwritten in the rules. Here's what I mean by this. Men and women might be different. Men and women are different objectively, but for purposes of the law in the West, in terms of inheriting property, opening up a bank account or whatever, right? No, everyone's completely equal. But this is an administrative thing. This is just more like a technical aspect of how we manage society or whatever, right? Or whatever. Everyone pays taxes at the same rate, or depending upon whatever your income bracket is, or so on and so forth. So that might be something, but the problem is that doesn't necessarily change the objective nature of the situation. And so an example of that one might be that, well, it's true, both men and women can open up, bank accounts, equally under the law. If you're looking at, let's say, height, or let's say physical prowess, on general, the average male is probably going to be bigger than the average female, just due to the way, again, that we're built. Another example is that the average female, compared to the average male, will be able to bear children, and no matter what you want to say or whatever, right?
The slight difference. I'm sure that the news today might tell you otherwise, but I have yet to meet a man who has birthed a child, and that would be a very large baby coming out of a particularly small hole. Moving on.
Thank you, Josh.
From the philosophical framework, Justin.
Yeah, okay, right. So anyways, objective versus subjective. So one of the things that I mentioned is, Josh, if you permit a slight detour, let me give you some background on this. Just a quick hat tip. George Friedman does a really good job of talking about this in his books, but an argument can be made, and an argument that I personally find persuasive, is that ever since the Enlightenment, a lot of the machinery of philosophy has been employed and put in service to separating or severing the obligation of society from man. Whether or not this is good or whether or not this is bad, you can open that up for debate. I would say that, Josh, if you were to use an economic example here, I think sometimes you do want to have things that can go into make-believe land, where you have subjective truth that can kind of conflict with objective truth. Hear me out. Let me take in economics for example. Consider the banking system, fractional reserve banking. To an extent, it probably makes sense for a bank to loan out capital to other things. This encourages, creativity, economic creativity, entrepreneurs to get funded, factories to be opened, society to grow for the betterment of it. I think the same thing is true also in personal development. You kind of want, the person to be as free as they possibly can be. But just like with banking, you want to have a reserve requirement. And just like with personal freedom, you need to have some limit. You don't want absolute freedom. You want as much freedom as you can get, but too much of a good thing can become a bad thing. And so along those lines, I think, and this gets back into what I would say is the modern day, one of the big questions in modern day philosophy, as I poorly understand it, is there or is there not objective truth? There are those, I would point to the Frankfurt School and the successors of that disaster, to argue emphatically that there is no constraint on the individual, or any constraint on the individual is automatically evil, it's patriarchal, or whatever, the nonsense people put into it. And while it is true that nobody likes to be constrained, sometimes it's in the best interest of everyone, even the person being constrained, to be constrained. My favorite go-to example is we all stop at red lights, even if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and no one's in the intersection. Why? Well, we're constrained, we're not getting home as quick, but having a working traffic system benefits us all, in the long run. And so even though you have the constraint, and this is what I would say the role of philosophy is that the constraint comes, nobody likes the constraint, but there's a convincing why that's attached to the constraint, where people can say, and not with a PhD in philosophy, but just like, oh, the average citizen can understand, oh, well, yeah, I've got to give this up. But in giving this up, I get so much more back. And it's simple and it's direct. And you could also make an argument too, that when you look at globalism, or think back what's going on in the Rust Belt or whatever, right? When you have the NAFTA and jobs being exported and factories being closed down, that might be better. I do not think it is, but momentarily accepting something I believe to be false, even if it was good or whatever, right? You've got to make an argument, and an argument that can be understood and be persuasive by the people who are losing their jobs. And you can't use some esoteric, well, it's, for the betterment of mankind, or, well, we don't want Greta Thunberg to be upset, so we're going to shut down all our coal operations, and Germans might freeze to death in the winter. Stuff like that. You always have to be able to reconcile it back, I think, to the individual and the average individual. Just like a bank always has to have, theoretically, at least until only recent times, had to have enough gold or, whatever the reserve asset was in their vaults to back up claims. So what I'm trying to say is that I think between subjective and objective truth, it's a very important balance. I do not think you would want only objective, nor do I think you want only subjective. You need to have, I would start with the objective, just like you would start with a bank, with real assets. And then I would kind of leverage up, or let creativity come into the thing. So you start removing, obligations on people, but only to, or just like a bank would lend out capital or whatever for projects or whatever, right? But only to the extent that it would make sense to do so. And I would also make certain that there was a way to put a call option on it, so that if people say, hey, wait a minute, we're getting a little too far over skis. Hey, wait a minute, we've gotten a little too woke. Hey, wait a minute, we've given out a little too much, debt here or whatever, right? You have a correction mechanism. But if you sever this mechanism between the objective and the subjective reality, it's like having a fiat, like a central bank of morality, in a sense, where you're able to continually double down and double down and double down and never actually admit that you were wrong, or I say, hey, wait a minute, we actually do have to have some constraints, or hey, maybe we moved a little too much towards individual freedom. We need to kind of pull things back a little bit. Just like a bank saying, hey, listen, maybe we made too many bad loans that aren't going to perform. And rather than being able to dump it on a central bank, we actually have to eat the loss and, write down our own equity to absorb the bad debt.
Yeah, for me, that I think about, let's say, what is an NPC? An NPC is something that has an automatic feedback mechanism towards any response that it gets. So some unknown event happens, and this NPC automatically experts out whatever it was already programmed to do.
Yeah.
And let's take the average student today. What does the average student know? It knows the bare minimum of pretty much all subjects. All these, let's say, more philosophical or controversial subjects. It knows exactly what it has been taught, and it knows probably 2 or 3 talking points on each of those thoughts. So if you are talking with someone and clashing ideas, or talking to 2 people that have the same viewpoint, you guys are talking about this subject and you would regurgitate, let's say, two or three information facts that you have previously heard. And therefore, because you have heard those before by so many different sources, that is your programmed kind of instinct to kind of sound smart in any sort of conversation. And that would be, I think, but from what you're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, that would be your subjective truth being spurred out, which you are falsely recognizing as an absolute truth.
Yes, the subjective truth would be whatever line the NPC is saying out, and the lack of objectivity means that the NPC is never being forced to confront or to look at their own biases as biases. Today, we're recording this on Friday. Supposedly, half of Twitter was just fired. Anyways, I shouldn't laugh at people's misery. But my point is this, is that actually Twitter's a good example of this, because if you had people that were living in a bubble, the bubble being a subjective truth, only now did they meet reality, the objective, nature of the business. And then generally when objective reality meets delusion, truth tends to win out over the lie.
But a lot of the times, like for these students today, they know what they know as absolute truth. Therefore, anything that is counterintuitive to it is instantly discarded as a conspiracy theory or as so wildly impossible because I am not wrong. Everything that I've heard is not wrong.
Yeah.
So I would reject anything that any sort of opposing view because it doesn't make sense to me.
So again, this is classic. This is when Bloom's talking about the closing of the American mind. This is the closing of the American mind in the sense that the mind is closed off to the fact that I might be wrong. The reason that's the case is that when you have to go back and reevaluate truth, it's hard to do, right? I mean, myself included, nobody likes doing it. And so if you never develop, the wherewithal, if you never develop the viewpoint, if you never develop the mental fitness in order to think about this, you just kind of cruise along. And when you cruise along these things, you essentially are having your opinions assigned to you by a third party. Whether or not, and the other thing that's sinister about this is that if you say hey, listen, you can have your opinions assigned to you, and people say, oh, I can never have my opinions assigned to me. That's the exact reason that you can have your opinions assigned to you. It's because you're not looking for it. You think it can happen to you, and whatever.
Yeah. So if I'm getting it right, the difference between the subjective truthers and the absolute, I would say there's not a single absolute truther, someone who thinks that there's absolute truths in the world, that would argue that all truths are absolute, for at least from a philosophical framework. They would agree in both. You kind of have to have both spectrums available because there are some things that are subjective, but people who do not believe in absolute truth they are completely closed off to the idea that there is something that can be absolute, because all I know is that everything is subjective and there are no certainties.
Yeah. That might be a good way.
That's all from a mind philosophical framework, not from a math and science. We're talking through the lens of the human brain, really.
Yeah, but also, in closing, let me also just throw this out there too. I'm really fond of going back and saying this. So, this is my accounting background coming in right here. You have the left side of the balance sheet, you have the right-hand side of the balance sheet. The left side is the real world, the asset side. The right-hand side is the contrived world, the imaginary side. Both are important. Both have to work in concert with one another. And the creativity and the development and the entrepreneurial spirit actually occurs on the right-hand side of the balance sheet. So it's really important to be able to have a disconnect to an extent between the real world and the way that we think the world can be. So that's a very important thing to have. The problem is that when you have a complete severance between these two sides and there's no, let's say, accountability, or there's no reconciliation mechanism, that's when you run into problems because you get a little far over your skis. And I would also say this is what, the postmodernists have sought to do from a moral framework. In other words, to quote Friedman here, they sought to elevate, since the beginning of the Enlightenment, they sought to elevate mankind to the center of the universe. Okay, well, great, we can do that. But the problem was they put man at the center of the universe without God, and man can't be there alone. God in this case being a stand-in for objective truth.
All right. Thank you guys, and we'll see you in the next one.